Thank you, Terry, and let me extend a warm welcome to all of you as well, and thank you for joining us. On behalf of the organizers, Ministry of Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation of Rwanda, the Rwanda Convention Bureau, ORF America, something we built during the pandemic, a new institution in Washington, D.C., and of course, ORF India. We are delighted to be here with all of you. Personally, I'm delighted to be back in Rwanda. I can actually share with you that number one on my to-do list once the pandemic allowed us to travel was coming back to Kigali. I am so fond of this place. I have traveled here often in the past few years, and not being able to come back for the last 2.5 years was something that was a big void in my life. And I am so happy that I'm back in this city that I love so much. I thought that perhaps by way of introduction to what we plan to do over the next 2.5 years, 2.5 days, the past 2.5 years and the next 2.5 days, I thought perhaps I could take a few notes out of my pandemic diary, how I was observing the world as we were isolated, quarantined, separated, and sometimes hopeless and helpless. I thought there were three emotions that I experienced. The first and most important amongst them as an academic, as someone who writes on global governance, was that once this is over, we must question global governance as it exists today, its institutions and its leadership. When the pandemic hit us, and if we are really honest, all of us in this room, we were left to our own devices. There was no cavalry coming to save us. We had to do it ourselves. If we are really honest, at the peak of the pandemic, it was every human for themselves. Countries were isolated, societies were quarantined, and global governance was missing in action. And we must promise ourselves that next time we will do better. And that investment must start today. What is the point of investing in these institutions if not for their reassuring presence during these dark times? And that must be something high on our agenda. As thinkers, as practitioners of policy, as global citizens, we must continue to push forward, and we must, of course, reshape how they work, who they serve, and the very purpose of their design. Global governance has to be the first question we respond to. And of course, let us also be honest here, the pandemic was a great leveler. There was no big power, there was no superpower, there was no great power. Selfish powers dominated the world. New York, London, Paris, Cape Town, Delhi, name the city. Everyone was devastated by the pandemic. Higher spending on healthcare, greater medical systems, better facilities, all of them counted for nothing. And perhaps it is time to rethink fundamental architecture of these response systems that we had put into place. Countries that had spent millions and billions of dollars on building medical capabilities were struggling to respond, as were the poorer nations. And perhaps instead of spending money in prestige projects, big budgets in rich nations, a more equitable distribution could have prevented the spread of the virus in geographies that were underprepared and had low infrastructure capabilities. Perhaps there is a lesson that we need to spread the capacities to respond in unison. If we care for ourselves, it will come for us, as the pandemic did. The second clear reality, or rather virtual reality, was the digitization of our societies. No policy by any political leader, no matter how charismatic, could have created this rate of digitization that the pandemic was able to do. Outstanding and astounding at the same time. Outstanding because we were able to connect, we were able to earn our livelihoods, we were able to remain engaged, we were able to, in some sense, continue as a community, as a society. And astounding simply because the institutions to protect these digital spaces, which are now so precious, simply don't exist. We saw digitization of everything. Individuals exist online, yet they live offline. They connect to near and dear ones offline, but communities are built online. Countries are now digital nations, and yet we continue to see wars to defend lines on a map. We must ask, have our politics and policies realigned themselves to the emergence of this digital society? Are we recognizing the digital arena as an independent domain? Something like a new geography, which requires its own sets of rules, principles, ethics, and governance? Or are we still seeing this as an instrument attached to our real world? Depending on how we assess this, we will come up with responses that are either suboptimal or ambitious, or perhaps the ones that are most appropriate. But this debate we must have. What do we do with the digital society the pandemic has in many ways incubated in the last 2.5 years? And then we are witnessing a reversal to parochialism, tribalism, and selfish behavior. We witness nations cannibalize production capabilities for their own selfish requirements, hijacked medical shipments, and weaponize their production capabilities. Like I mentioned, there were no saints. There were shades of sinners. And all of us are implicated by these actions. And this behavior, this selfish tribal behavior, was endorsed by national medias, was actually demanded by electorate on the streets. And that begins the larger debate, that how do we rectify this? We have seen a recession of globalism. It's not just a recession of economy. We are more interconnected, but we trust each other less. We care about each other less. We are less empathetic. Even as we continue to engage more deeply, we need new leadership. And that's the question I ask myself. That who are the next generation of leaders who will rebuild globalization of a different format? I don't think we need to invest in perverse dependencies. In fact, we need to create smart, interconnected resilience. The globalization of tomorrow must be very different to the texture of yesterday. But finally, like I said in the beginning, and I must conclude with this thought, I remember having tweeted something out during the dark days in Delhi in April of last year, and Dr. Arvind Gupta was my co-traveler in Delhi at that point of time. Both of us had the Delta wave and we were responding to our own illnesses. I remember tweeting out, community is the cavalry. And that is my final thought, that the single most important investment that we can make today is in building communities. And the Kigali Global Dialogue is an attempt to build that community. We are not going to give you the silver bullet to solve all problems. We are not here to give you a prescription for what your governments might adopt, but we are here to be your fellow humans on a journey that we will undertake together. May you all enjoy the ride over the next 2.5 days, and may we all discover important lessons on the way. Thank you for joining us at this dialogue, and I'm turning it back to Terry to take the evening forward. Thank you very much.